All right, welcome to part 5 of our Power Automate Approvals series, where we're going to talk about creating an audit trail. Now, this is not something that is specific to approval processes. You might want to create audit trails for other types of flows, other situations where you have transactions happening, requests being made, etc. So there are a lot of other scenarios where you might want to create an audit trail. It's just something that I have, for me, it's second nature to include these in any approval flows that I do, just because invariably I need a way to, down the road, give people access to sort of a what I call the 5,000-foot view of the process, so they can see that, when the approval or when the request came in, what action was taken, who did that, what was the outcome, etc. So that's basically what led me to starting to do this in the first place. So first off, let's talk a little bit about why an audit trail is really needed. Well, you're probably thinking, well, if I build the flow, I can go and look at the flow run history to see what happened as part of that flow. And yes, that is fantastic. That is really useful, especially when you first build your flow or first start deploying it, so you can debug it and see what's wrong, what went wrong, and how to fix it. But the point is that flow run history is only visible to people who are owners of that flow. And you do not want to make everybody who's going to be using that process an owner of the flow. It's a bad idea. So don't even, just put that out of your head. Don't even consider it. Basically, what will happen is someone will delete that flow. It's happened to me. It's painful, but so don't make everyone else an owner of the flow. Maybe have one other owner, but that's another story. So you can view the flow run history, but nobody else can. Even if you look at just saying, well, what about the approvals? Because in the Power Automate website, there is that action items section where there are approvals, and I can see the approvals that I've sent and the approvals that I've received and the history of those. But those are only available to, the person who is sending the requests, is the requester. They'll see the approvals that they've sent and the history of those that they have sent or completed. And the approver, whoever the approval is assigned to, is going to see the approvals that they've received and the approvals that they've completed in their history. So only those parties, the approvers and requesters, have that visibility into in the approval center. So that's kind of out. And the other thing is, even if those two things, the flow run history and the approval history, were enough for your, immediate needs of being able to see what's going on with your flows or the process, neither of those are permanent. The flow run history is only around for 28 days, and the approval history, I believe, is records are purged out of there after 93 days. Not 100% sure on the timing of that. It might be 120, but I'm pretty sure it's 93. Point being that if you need to see what happened in a process that took place 6 months ago, you can't do that using those built-in mechanisms. So that's why building your own audit trail or your own audit log list, whatever you want to call it, I'm going to try to do that in SharePoint, but because it's kind of the most convenient, but you could do it in some other format if you want it. Excel, I don't care, but I'm focusing on SharePoint because most of you are probably working in that environment. And the really important thing is to figure out what you actually want to record. So the flow run history is going to show you every single thing that happens in the course of that flow. That doesn't mean you need to log every single one of those actions. So you do want to, as you're going through your process, kind of identify the key points, the milestones, you want to call them, of when the approval is assigned, when the approval decision is made, and if there's any response for, whatever it might be as simple as those two records: approval assigned, approval completed. But know that if you have a more complicated process, if it's going through multiple layers of approval, you can log each of those steps individually if you need to. But yeah, you don't want to go overboard and log every single thing, but log what you need to record or what you need to be able to refer to later. So in terms of what an audit trail really is, it's a detailed record of the transactions in a process. So an approval is a transactional process. Someone is asking for something, someone else is responding to that request and giving them an answer of yes or no. The audit trail should be accessible to anyone who's going to be involved in overseeing the process. So chances are, if you're the one who built the flow and you're involved in the process yourself, then that's you. But chances are there are going to be other people who want to see that, your manager or maybe somebody else. If you're building this for a department in your organization, they're going to have one or more people who need to kind of look in and see what happens in the course of these different processes. So you want to make sure you put it in a place that all those people have access to, whoever should have access to view the history. And you do want it to show sort of the life cycle of the process. So if there are 5 steps in your process, then you're probably going to end up with 5 records in that audit log list for each item that's going through the process. Now, in some cases, you don't need to log every single step, as I said. For example, if it's something like they submit a form and that creates an item and then you do an approval on that item, you don't necessarily need to log that they created the item, because if they filled out the form and it created the item, that's your proof that that item got created. And you can see when that got created and by whom, although it's going to be whoever built the flow. But the point being that you can really identify, you don't need to necessarily log that they submitted the form, because there are other ways of getting that information. But you still want to make sure that the other parts of the process are kind of included in there. Now, what details of each action do you want to include? And again, we're going to be building this as a SharePoint list because that's, again, what's convenient for most people. And here are kind of the 5 key points, really 4 key points and 1 optional that I always include. So there's the action, and I just reuse the title field. So I rename the title field to action, and that's going to give us basically allow us to specify what happened. Was the approval created? Was the approval completed? Etc. Next up, who took the action? So if the approval is assigned, then it's being assigned, and we're going to say that that was taken by the person who submitted the form, or the request. So the requester is the person who took that action. A timestamp, so when exactly did that happen? This might not be relevant in all situations, but it's usually a good thing to have, if only to be able to see kind of a time-based view of your process to see how long it's taking from one step to the next, or one action to the next. The related item ID, and this is really, really important to have, because basically you want to be able to tie all of these actions back to the thing on which they are, or to which they are connected. So in our case, we're going to submit a form. It's creating an item in a list, so it's the ID, the internal ID number of that item, that we're going to use as the related item ID, so that later we can do things like create a filtered list of the audit log list to show only the items related to that particular, or only the entries related to that item. And then the outcome or decision column, this is optional. I usually include it for things like approvals, just because I like having that. You can incorporate it into the action, like say, approval approved or approval rejected as the action, and do away with the outcome or decision column. But I like having that as a separate column, just mainly to separate it out and be able to see what the outcomes were. And granted, some of your actions, like assigning the approval, is not really going to have an outcome because there's no decision that's been made, it's just been assigned. So you don't need that, but I like having it. And then you can include whatever other fields you'd like. If there are other relevant details that you want to include in that that audit log item, that's up to you. I'll leave that to your imagination. So let's just jump over and take a look at our process here. So we have this scheme submission form, working again in my escape planning site, and I want people in our organization to be able to submit schemes for that might be related to escape, but basically we're sort of an all-encompassing department. So we want to let people submit a scheme, where they're going to give it a name, select a type of scheme, whether it's an escape, a disruption, or a revolt, and then provide a scope to identify kind of who it's relevant to, or who would be involved in it. So we got that, and then we have all of those going into basically entries that are forms that are submitted, create items in this list where we have the title, the type of scheme, and the scope. And then, because the idea here is that when a scheme comes in, I want to route that information to one of the, whoever is the expert in our group on that type of scheme. So what I did is I created another SharePoint list here called Scheme SMEs, or Subject Matter Experts, and the values in the title column just match the choices in the type, so escape, disruption, and revolt. And we'll see that if it's an escape, that'll go to Andrew, disruptions go to James, and revolts go to Robert. So basically that, if a revolt scheme comes in, Robert looks at it, and on his approval it will then kind of go to the entire committee or the larger audience, but he's the gatekeeper of those schemes. Now what we need to do is create our audit log, and I've actually already done that. So in our scheme audit log, we've got the title field that I've renamed to action. Pretty basic. I've got a person field for action taken by, and using a person field, I like doing that or using that type because it then gives me the ability to, because person is a complex data type, yeah, it's a little bit more complicated to work with in some scenarios, some situations, but the fact that I get not just their name but also their email address and their department and their manager potentially, you get more bang for your buck using that person field. Then I have a date and time field for the timestamp. I have the scheme ID and the outcome of that action. All right, so that's that, and then I'm going to jump over to our flow. We already had a flow set up, which is when a response is submitted, it's getting the details, it's handling those scopes, it's then creating an item in our schemes list with the name, the type, and the scope. So all that's good. Now what I need to do, or what I've added, so that we know who to assign this approval to, we need to get items from that scheme SMEs list, and we're filtering this so it's a get items list or get items action, so it's getting multiple items from a SharePoint list, potentially multiple items, and filtering them to those where the title of the list, which is that matches the types in our form, is equal to the type that was selected on the form. So pretty simple, pretty basic. And then based on the outcome of that get items action, I am using a select action to retrieve from the, so this is returning an array of data. Even though it's only going to be a single item, it's still going to be formatted as an array, so we still need to handle it as an array. Select takes an array and returns an array of a specific property, character, or subfield, etc. So what I'm doing is from the get items action, all of the response, I'm returning just the SME email. And I've got another video where I show how to do this. Pretty nothing too exciting. Now, when I'm creating the approval, I need to decide what approval type it is. So I'll just go with, because I'm only going to assign it to one person, first to respond works just fine. And you could also use the start and wait for an approval. I've just kind of gotten used to using the separate create an approval and wait for an approval. I find it's whenever I build something with start and wait for an approval, then someone later says, well, we want reminders. So then I'm back to rewriting it with two separate actions. So I just use the two separate actions to begin with now. All right, so we're going to include our approval type, first to respond. The title is going to be approval needed for scheme, and we'll plug in, not that, but the let me go to our response details. Name of scheme. I couldn't remember what I called it. So approval needed for name of scheme. And then I'm going to assign that to. Now, remember I said that this select takes an array of the get items output and returns an array of the email addresses of those SMEs, or even though it's only going to return one, if I were to just plug in the output of this select, it's going to throw and apply to each around this, which I want to avoid. So what I'm going to do is go over to expression and go to first, which is going to get me the first, and yes, it's the only, but still it's the first output of that select action. And click OK, and there we go. So this is going to assign it to just that one first SME email. And then in details, I can include, the name of the scheme, the type of scheme, which they're already going to know, and then we'll throw in the scope. And I do also want the responder, so I'll say this was submitted by responder's email. So that's it. That's really all. Oh, and the requester, I do want to put in the requester again. We'll use the responder's email for the requester there, so it will show up as being from that person. All right, so that's creating our approval. So now that we've created the approval, I want to log that approval was created. And this is another reason to use a separate create and wait, because if you just did the start and wait for an approval, none of basically it's going to wait for that approval to complete before anything can be logged. So you do need to make sure that you are using the separate create and wait actions here. So what I want to do is create an item, and again we're going to select the escape planning. This time it's going to be our scheme audit log, and once I select that, it's going to give me the schema for that. So the title, again, I renamed title to action, but it's still called title internally because it's still the internal name of it. But this is going to be approval created and assigned. Action taken by is going to be the requester. Now it says claims, but it will also take an email address. So I'm going to go to, again, the responder's email, because again, they're the person who, even though they're not creating this item, they're the ones who are creating the approval by submitting the form. Timestamp. Now I could just put in put in the expression UTC now. The problem is that will give me the timestamp in UTC, not necessarily your local time. For simplicity, I'm going to leave it as UTC now, but just know that if you want it to be your local time, you would need to wrap that in a convert from UTC expression to get it to your local time zone. There are other videos out there on how to do that, so I'm not going to show you that here. But then the scheme ID is going to be the ID of the item that created. So let me go back here and let me rename this to create scheme, just so that it's a good practice, and it means that down here when I go to my dynamic content, I can say, oh, there's the create scheme action as opposed to just this generic create item or action. And then the outcome, just going to leave blank. So it's not a required field, so I can leave that blank. So that is, we've now, and again, let me, once I can, I'm going to rename this, and I'll say rename create audit log entry approval assigned. All right, and then I'm going to add a new step here, and this will be the wait for an approval. And I'm not going to go through the entirety of this flow, but I want to do enough to give you an idea that you basically the process is going to be throughout this flow. After each milestone, you're going to create an entry in that log. So we're going to wait for the approval ID, and then basically that means when that wait for approval fires, it means the approval's done. So guess what we're going to do? We're going to create an audit log entry. So to save myself a little time, I'll copy that to the clipboard and then paste it and rename it to approval completed. And then in here, I can put approval completed. Now in this case, the action taken by is not going to be the requester. It's going to be the approver. So what I'm going to do is grab and again, because approvers could be plural, could be multiple, I need to use that first expression again. So first, and then go to our approvals, the create approval, actually the wait for an approval. So the first of the you know what, we'll just do it the lazy way because I'm having a brain cramp on a Friday afternoon of how to actually get this. But let's wait for the approval, and we'll go with the come on. And it's going to throw it into an apply to each, but again, because we only have one approver, it's only going to run once. I'm not too worried about that. Again, there are better ways to handle that. I'm just taking a shortcut right now. And then the outcome is going to be the outcome of the approval. Now, it is kind of important to, because if I were to select the responses approver response, which not aside from being a bit redundant, is also an array, so it can get kind of messy. So rather than selecting that, I'm going to use outcome, which is just the overall outcome, the singular outcome of the approval, which is perfectly fine. So that's what we're going to do. Hit save. And now, just to take this for a test drive, I'm going to go back over to and I'm going to submit a scheme here. So let's preview this and say this will be a balloon flight test. It will be a disruption. Actually, it's going to be an escape because that's whose account I'm signed into there. And this would be an individual or small group because balloons don't hold many people. And we'll submit that. And then we can go back. And it failed. Why did it fail? Ah, I see why it failed. Because I forgot single quotes. Single quotes are important. So when you're doing these filter queries, you need to wrap the text you're matching in single quotes. So let's save that, and we can just resubmit the last failed thing. Okay, third time's a charm. Okay, so it's getting the items. It's then going to select, and I can go over to my scheme audit log here. Momentarily, I should see the audit log entry pop in there. Okay, it did return that. Don't know why it's taking so long. Okay, here we go. So we can see that it created the approval, it created the audit log entry, and there we go. We can see that the approval was created. It's taken by me because I submitted it, and I don't have in here who it was assigned to. So again, you might want to factor that in. I probably should have, but I didn't. So now I'm going to go over to another browser where I'm signed in as Andrew, who is the SME for escapes, and I can see that he has an approval needed for scheme balloon flight test, and he is going to approve that, submit it, and momentarily we will see, once that's finished, you can see it's waiting for the approval, finished, applied to each, and there we have the approval completed by Andrew Carter. And then we have this scheme ID of 18, which matches the schemes over here. So if I show the ID column, you can see there's balloon flight test, and those were the first 2 attempts. We'll just get rid of those. But now what I could do is, if I wanted to link to those, basically a filtered view of the scheme audit log showing only those where the scheme ID is 18, I can pretty easily build a filtered view here. So filter by, it's like that. And then we have this format that we can use as part of the a list formatting or column formatting rule over in the schemes list, so that this would actually be a hyperlink over to the view of those entries. So that's another video for another time, but I did want to just kind of talk through the process of why you want to create an audit log list, how to do it, what to include in there, And hopefully that makes sense to everyone, and that you find this useful. So realize this is a longer video. Hopefully it was beneficial to you, and realize we had a couple bumps along the way there, but nothing too drastic. So it's going to be a while until I get to the next video because I'm going to be out of town for a bit, but when I get to it, that will be working with approval response data. So when that response comes in, we did a very quick, you know, log it, but we might also want to do other things. So we'll talk in more detail about sort of what that array of data that comes back and the responses array looks like, what values we get from that, how we can use them, and kind of the thing that most people want is the ability to identify what the response was and the comments that were left. So we'll talk about all that in the next video. So hopefully this was useful to you. If you have any questions, throw those in the comments down below, and have a great day.